Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's event. My name is Will Pomeranz, and I'm Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute, and we're pleased to have a very distinguished panel to talk about Ukrainian local elections. Before I get started, I just want to remind you that you can follow the activities of the Kennan Institute by looking at our website and focusing on our upcoming events. I also want to remind the audience that we will have plenty of time for questions. So if you want to ask a question for our guests, you can submit it via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter Institute, or on our Facebook page. Please include your name and affiliation when sending your questions. Well, today we're going to talk about regional elections, but we're also going to have a caveat because events move on. But we're focusing on the regional elections because the reform of local government began in 2015 as one of the major demands of the Euromaidan. Since then, the key achievement of decentralization policy was the empowerment of local communities through merging local districts. In July 2020, the Rada radically decreased the number of local administrations, and they have now just undergone these elections. So we're going to have our distinguished panelists discuss the results of the local elections, who now governs these reform localities, and what the consequences of the elections might be on local reforms in the near future. However, as I mentioned, events move on, and the focus on Ukraine has in many ways moved from these elections to the current constitutional crisis. And I think that we need to address this constitutional crisis on this panel in the context of where Ukraine is going, what the controversy is, and ultimately how it will affect regional and national politics. So I'm sure all of you are aware of the Ukrainian Constitutional Court's decision to declare unconstitutional the provision of the Criminal Code of Ukraine that provides for punishment for inaccurate declaration of assets. This has sparked a huge controversy and has ultimately led to President Zelensky proposing on October 30th the bill on renewal of confidence in constitutional judiciary, which proposes to terminate the powers of judges of the Constitutional Court. So what we're going to do is we're going to begin with a brief update as to the state of this constitutional crisis, and then move on to the impact of these regional elections. And so our first speaker will be Dr. Mykhailo Minakov, who will talk about this ongoing constitutional crisis. He is the Kennan Institute Senior Advisor on Ukraine and Editor-in-Chief of Focus Ukraine, the Kennan Institute's Ukraine Focus blog. He defended his doctoral dissertation at the Kiev Institute of Philosophy in 2007. His main research interest is in political modernization in Eastern Europe, theories and practices of revolution, political imagination, and ideologies. So we're going to begin with Misha, and then I'll introduce the other two speakers when I introduce them later on in the program. So Mykhailo, floor is yours.
Thank you, Will. Well, we are currently in a situation of combined political and constitutional crisis with certain unforeseeable consequences. So on 25th November, the local elections in all local and regional governments, old and new, were testing how prepared is administrative territorial system. In a way, it was a stress test for entire administrative territorial system created between 2015 and today. But also, these elections were testing the new electoral system based on new electoral code that was reformed a little bit also last summer. So we didn't give up the rule that we change electoral rules before the elections. We also were testing new political regime that was established a year ago, and that was based on electoral success of a very popular personality. So will the Zelensky effect prevail in Ukrainian elections? That was also at stake. And as OSCE or DIR Commission reported they recognized elections as free and fair, but with certain violations. And one of the biggest violations is connected to the presidential initiative of the so-called 5 questions. The very initiative was announced just a few weeks before elections. It was a presidential initiative, and the questions were really strange. I will not recall them right now here, but approximately 55 polling stations were having those people who were doing the questioning. And there is a different result to the questioning. But today, we do not know how representative can these answers be to all the 5 questions that President asked the nation. But at the same time, as OSCE monitors mentioned, this can be regarded as a political trick to motivate supporters and promote a presidential party during the vote day. So in a way, here, the beginning of certain controversy started. Also, the results of elections, which we do not know up until today, 10 days later, there were like early results discussions, and opposition and journalists had a very strong voice saying that president has actually lost his charisma, lost his aura of victor in elections. However, all these debates ceased to exist on October 27, right after elections, when the Constitutional Court of Ukraine has announced its decision that some norms of the law on corruption prevention and criminal code contradict Ukrainian constitution. And well, the principle here is that executive institutes have the right to control judiciary through these laws and norms. It's more and more evidence today that the decision of the Constitutional Court was actually ready in early October, but they postponed announcement up until after elections. So they didn't want to add the political debate before the elections. These decisions were expected by legal community since the anti-corruption draft laws were followed by very critical assessments of the Rada's legal experts in the phase of parliamentary review. However, the Rada MPs did not pay attention to these warnings, so certain norms were regarded as not entirely constitutional or contradictory by the parliamentary experts themselves. Finally, 2 judges out of the 15 Constitutional Court judges declared their personal disagreement with the court's decision. So in a way, the decision itself had a lot of internal problems, but also the decision was made with conflict of interest among judges. And since there is a regime of secrecy about the distribution of votes, we can only guess who had those conflict of interests. Finally, the decision led to certain political and criminal change in Ukraine. First of all, about 200 criminal investigations on charges of corruption were closed, mainly by Anti-Corruption Prosecution Office and by National Bureau to Fight Corruption. There was a closure of e-assets declaration system run by the Agency to Prevent Corruption. And there are obstacles for functioning of recently created anti-corruption institutions, but also there is a problem for newly elected officials in the local elections to enter into their posts because they have to enter their declarations into the e-assets declaration system. The decision was immediately sharply criticized by President Zelensky administration, anti-corruption NGOs, and G7 embassies. President Zelensky initiated the meeting of National Security Council that supported presidential will, to dismiss the Constitutional Court judges who voted for the decision and return for the return of anti-corruption institutions back to their usual work. Simultaneously, the Cabinet of Ministers has issued a document ordering Agency for Prevention of Corruption to open access of the assets declaration system. And President Zelensky submitted draft law to the Rada, stipulating dismissal of Constitutional Court and declaring its decision on corruption prevention law also dismissed. Head of Constitutional Court was called for interrogation to the State Bureau of Investigations, and also there are a lot of media outlets publishing documents that the chair of Constitutional Court owns a land in the annexed Crimea. So the compromat war started also. Several hours and days later, the Council of Europe's Venice Commission, Democracy Through the Rule of Law, and a number of legal experts and politicians made statements in defense of Constitutional Court. Constitutional Court decisions, according to our constitution, cannot be overruled. And Constitutional Court's Commission immunity, Constitutional Court's immunity should be respected. Executive branch should not put political pressure on the judges of Constitutional Court. Also, the change of Constitutional Court members should be done in accord with the Constitution and laws, not through the sort of decrees or ad hoc decrees. And finally, presidential draft law, as experts say, contradicts Constitution and may create legal grounds for impeachment. And of course, opposition was already discussing the possibilities for the impeachment of President Zelensky. Well, basically, Ukraine has entered into November this year with Constitutional Court with questioned legitimacy and reputation, with executive branch being in open conflict with judiciary branch of power, with legal problems for activities of anti-corruption institutions, and with problematic beginning for the work of local administrations for newly elected leaders of local governments. And at the same time, up until today, 10 years after elections, we have no final results in the vast majority of administrative units. Preliminary results are indeed unfavorable for President Zelensky and his team. So we also witnessed a historically lowest attendance. Less than 37% of registered voters did not come. And the sociological polls, which seems to be much better in Ukraine than in some other developed democracies, they show that Ukrainian voters did not show up, not necessarily because of the COVID epidemic, but also because they either felt that the new electoral system, proportional system, is too difficult, or they didn't have enough time, or they didn't have their own, the personality or the party they would like to support. So far, the distribution of the votes that we know about is saying that presidential party received approximately 20% across the country from 22 to 15 in oblast councils. So this major achievement of the presidential party. However, East and West divide seems to return in Ukraine. We have Petro Poroshenko's European Solidarity Party winning in Western oblasts, and opposition platform support in Southeastern oblasts make this political party, this part of opposition, very influential at local level. They both received approximately 14 to 15% in big cities and in oblast councils. And also we witnessed the establishment of new political force, local parties that belong to local mayors or local clans, and they established control over city councils of the biggest cities. And these new parties are not necessarily loyal to central government, especially in times of COVID-19 quarantine. So basically here is this strange combination of political and constitutional crisis and the local elections without defined results. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Misha. Ukraine is always interesting, and your talk just highlighted all the ways in which Ukraine remains a very interesting and changing political dynamic. We're now going to hear from Dr. Vita Dumanska. She is the CEO of Chesna Movement, which is the leading political watchdog organization in Ukraine. She has over 14 years of professional experience in public campaign management, advocacy, and program development at non-governmental and international organizations. She previously worked at the Kiev School of Economics as a project manager. Vita, the floor is yours.
Okay, hello everybody. I know that America counts votes in Trump's and Biden competition. Ukraine is also counting, despite the fact that our election were held like 20 days ago. So we're still in the process. I would like to share with you a recent update in Ukrainian electoral legislation and its impact on political system. So the local election, as Misha told, were held on the newly amendment legislation. The electoral code was adopted adopted by previous parliament, but the current parliament adopted crucial changes 1 month before the start of the campaign. And these changes were adopted like when negotiation between Zelensky party and like pro-Russian parliamentary party. In the efforts of conducting the election reform simultaneously with the decentralization reform, many legislative contradictions and gaps arose. So the rule of games were changing during the election campaign, even not 1 month ahead, but we had these changes while the campaigning was in the process. So the election system and regulation remain unclear for both for candidates and political parties, as well as for voters. So the most significant amendments of the election rules, they include the attempt to introduce party list proportional representation in the city with over 10,000 voters. The mandatory requirement to political parties on the minimal number of the nominated candidates, it might be up to 80% of number seats in the council. And also in Ukraine, gender quota was introduced at 40% level. So it was mentioning that compliance with gender quota was obligatory only at the stage of candidates' nomination, but not at their official registration. Chesna observed the fact that women haven't even agreed to run, but she was included in the party list. So we don't have official results yet, but we expect that more women will enter Ukrainian politics. For example, in the city of Lviv, representation of women in city council increased just by 1%. But in Kiev council, the faction of women rose by 10%. And also we observed that voters of Nationalist Party demonstrated the commitment not to support women since it's the party of strong like male leadership. The open list that was quite innovation of this campaign, they actually became a close in the practice. It happens because of the legislators who introduced the election quota and developed a complicated ballot. For example, according to the preliminary results, in Kiev Council, only 5% of candidates achieved the quota percentage and they automatically received their mandate. Meanwhile, 65 candidates achieved the 25th quota and they went up in the list, but it doesn't mean they will be elected at the councillors. So, in fact, the system works properly only for the parties with the high level of support, while it has worked for everyone. So similarly, the complicated ballot did not enhance the candidate chance to rise in the list based on voters' choice. As a result, a number of uncounted ballots which were incorrectly filled in has significantly increased. And in some polling station, it was like 7%. That's quite high. So because of weak political party structures, it was challenging to recruit the necessary number of nominated candidates in order to meet the minimal requirement introduced by electoral code. Like it was an obstacle for the parties to involve the women. Some of them, they were seeking for women in the Instagram stories and the vacancies websites in their attempt to recruit female candidates. As well, new political system is oriented toward political parties with work on the development and hence and have strong party structures. However, political parties building is not a success story in Ukraine. So we have about 350 political parties. And according to the Chesno, more than half of parties have changed their names at least once since their registration. So it's demonstrates that political parties live during one election cycle, and they are like short-term projects, which followed by the change of brand as well change of so-called owner. According to the new rules, the candidates could run for the election in only nominated by a political party. We use the term partization to describe the change in the nomination procedures. As a result, partization caused a massive launch of regional party projects, as Misha mentioned before. For instance, 1/3 of mayors in city of oblast level run for election using their own political parties. And majority of them won the first round of the election. So they won in the first round of the election. These chants enhance the decentralization processes and strengthens the tensions between Kiev and the region. The candidates nominated by Zelensky party for the mayor's position have no chance to win in any of big cities. So overall party get from second to fourth rank in the council list. It means that servant of the people lose this election. And the central authority released that in newly elected councils, their representatives will work in opposition. The president was actively involved in the agitation process. And as Misha told before, we have these 5 questions from the president, which were not recognized and not supported by the parliament, by the Central Election Commission. President was running a campaign while we had while he had to work on international level and on security policy. In particular, Ukraine didn't react timely on political situation on Belarus while he was visiting regions with his political party. So when it comes to financial aspect, we can claim that campaign was actually unlimited. We have limits in parliamentary campaign, but here we don't. So the election code imposed the limits on the donation made by a physical person and forbids legal entities to fund the campaign. But at the same time, the election code still has an obsolete procedure of making donation on the election accounts. The parties could have gone beyond the procedure of collecting the donation on their current accounts. And since the regular report submission was postponed because of COVID, it was impossible to reveal the donors of the different political parties and inform citizens who actually finance the political party. Misha told that constitutional crisis is focused on declaration, but also here issue of party finance arise because the National Agency of Corruption Prevention was taken from their function, even in terms of checking financial reports of political party. And today, head of the agency made a very interesting statement saying that the Constitutional Court took off all their responsibilities, and the only one which stays is to check declaration of the judges, because it's special regulation for that. So my main conclusions are the following. The election legislation needs to be improved to ensure that the next election are conducted more effectively and transparently. Second, the election demonstrated that the president and his party lost the voters' support. And third, Ukraine is on the edge of political crisis, which is deepened with constitutional crisis, and we should pay attention on that. So that's all from my side.
Thank you very much, Vita. Before I turn to our final speaker, I just want to remind our audience that if you have questions, you can submit them via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page. Please include your name and affiliation with these questions. So our final speaker this morning is Dr. Olena Lennon. She is an adjunct professor of political science and national security at the University of New Haven. Her current research is focused on questions of political legitimacy, conflict management, and identity politics. Her work has appeared in numerous prominent journals, including Foreign Affairs, The National Interest, and Nationalities paper. And she is a former Title VIII short-term scholar at the Kennan Institute. So Elena, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Will. And thank you everybody for joining us today. I know there's a lot going on, but as they say, all politics is local politics, right? So it's always timely to be talking about local elections. So I'm gonna try and build on what Vita and Misha have presented so far and securitize the conversation, if you will. I'm gonna try and offer some of my thoughts as to how the results of local elections map into the overall security situation in Ukraine. Unfortunately, I observed elections remotely this year. Last year, I observed presidential and parliamentary elections in Ukraine as part of the international observation mission, but due to COVID, unfortunately, I could only do a remote observation, so to say. But nonetheless, let me offer, to add to what Misha and Vita have said, I want to offer my main three observations. One, I want to echo Misha in saying that the servant of the People's Party, by suffering general defeat in local elections and being unable to win a single mayoral race or even a majority in any regional parliamentary or parliamentary city council, coupled with the constitutional crisis, the deadlock in Donbass, and little progress of the trilateral contact group, it is pretty clear that it's not just Zelensky's administration that's in trouble, but the efficacy of Zelensky as a brand or as a political project, if you will, has also been undermined and diminished. In fact, Zelensky seems to be playing a game of whack-a-mole, quite literally, as there are multiple crises unraveling around him. And time and again, he has shown that his problem-solving instincts are reactive, authoritarian, and self-defeating. And his main opponents also revealed in the last local elections, Опозиційна платформа за життя, Opposition Platform for Life, OPZZ, Poroshenko's party, European Solidarity, and Yulia Tymoshenko's party, Batkivshchina, Fatherland, are exploiting his weaknesses to their own advantage. But to bring it back to local elections, the first thing that stands out to me is that it's clear that Zelensky has not only lost the support of the people, but also his sponsors, because the usual suspects, the oligarchs seem to be reinvesting into new brands and new faces and new political projects. I think that Zelensky made a mistake by declaring early on that he was only going to stay one term. And that made him a lame duck prematurely, because he rode the waves of populism to get elected. But it's clear that his business leaders and powerful oligarchs are investing in other political projects, not least in preparation for parliamentary elections. So to me, the last local elections in large part signified ways in which parliamentary elections are being mapped out and prepared, especially by looking at which parties the oligarchs, again, the usual suspects, are likely to back. So on the one hand, as Vita said, there seems to be a great variety of parties, more than 350, But on the other hand, they're not necessarily local parties per se, right? They are, again, there's significant funding behind some of these local projects that are indicative of, the Kolomoisky, Akhmetov, some of the other powerful groups investing in new faces and maximizing their levers of influence in local and regional governments, with the idea in mind that they will kind of cash in on that investment in parliamentary elections. One of the obvious examples of a seemingly local party that has significant backing of national level politicians is, Mariupol's party, Blok Vadima Boychenko. Vadim Boychenko, who is the mayor of Mariupol, kind of positioned his bloc as a local Mariupol party, and it is leading in Mariupol City Council elections, and Vadim Boychenko obviously is also leading in mayoral elections. But the party enjoys significant backing of Rinat Akhmetov, who is a regional and national player in elections, formerly a proxy of opposition platform, but now he's not necessarily pro-Russia per se. He's pro-business, right? His main objective is to retain control of Mariupol because of the Mariupol port. So that way, a local party of Mariupol is not necessarily local in its agenda and its design. Another example is, of course, everybody's interested in what Kolomoisky is up to. And I think the last local elections also showed that Kolomoisky is losing interest in Zelensky. He seems frustrated and disappointed in his ability to deliver. Zelensky, again, kind of served its purpose by, getting elected, but he hasn't really been able to deliver as much. So the party that Kolomoisky is currently supporting, Samay for the future, as Ukrainians affectionately call Maybach. Again, it's not seemingly regional party. It's doing very well especially in Volyn region, and the mayor of Lutsk is currently a member of the party too, and the leader of Samay is Kolomoisky's long-standing business partner. But again, it's only regional and local in its appearance because Kolomoisky is spreading his influence by investing in a variety of projects. So again, I just kind of want to address this illusion that that these parties are local because the usual suspects are behind some of these efforts. Another reason local elections are a perfect opportunity to make smart investments in parliamentary elections is exactly because of decentralization reform. Thanks to the reform, heads of these amalgamated territorial communities, the newly created communities, ATCs, enjoy significant financial autonomy in local infrastructure development projects. Some of them have existed, for more than a couple of years that have amalgamated early on. So now they have moved past incidental projects such as trash disposal, road repairs, and have actually started a long-term infrastructure development projects such as emergency management services, schools, reconstruction programs, and things of that nature. So local leaders are now ascribed more legitimacy in the eyes of their constituents than national leaders because of their ability to deliver on their promises because of all the funding that's available to them right now. So this is classic performance-based legitimacy, right? Which is quite common in Ukrainian political culture, where voters ascribe legitimacy to anyone who will deliver public services. And of course, the big front runners, the mainstream parties are wise to want to be associated with those success stories at local levels so that they can convert them and instrumentalize those success stories into personal victories in parliamentary elections. The second takeaway for me in these last local elections was that in a way, and that's kind of what Misha alluded to earlier, local elections signified a return to normal political dynamics in Ukraine, namely political polarization along regional lines. That unprecedented unity that Zelensky demonstrated a year ago that transcended regional borders and regional lines and defined his candidacy and his political phenomenon has worn off. And we're now seeing a return to sort of normal regional polarization that had existed in Ukraine prior to that, especially as they're manifested in the juxtaposition of the opposition party, OPZG, Opposition Platform for Life, and Poroshenko's party, European Solidarity, as being sort of two vectors of that regional polarization. However, regionalism and regional cleavages in the current political environment are much more threatening to Ukraine's national security. And to that end, I think decentralization and local elections that marked the completion of the decentralization reform is one of the most important and critical reforms for Ukraine's national security, and Zelensky can take partial credit for that because it can actually mitigate regional cleavages. And that is due to the fact that these amalgamated territorial communities, ATCs, were given a rather wide mandate for fund management and revenue administration, and money flows directly from Kiev, bypassing rayons, districts, and oblasts, regions. And it has allowed local self-governing bodies to further decouple from the power vertical established by districts and regions. And in doing so, decentralization reduced the political leverage and corruption previously concentrated in regional centers. So now that influence and leverage is spread across these amalgamated territorial communities. And I think that accomplishes a couple things. One, denying oblast regional governments direct control of local communities, undermines regional mobilization, or makes regional mobilization more challenging. And that is a dynamic that can be potentially threatening in Ukraine's security environment, as we saw in 2014, when large regional centers like Kharkiv and Odessa had significant anti-government movements emerging both organically and with the help of Russian instigators and various other proxies. So the bottom line is, decentralization has moved the center of gravity, if you will, from regions back to Kiev. And in that aspect, it is likely to prevent further fracturing along regional lines and facilitate better social cohesion and unity. And along those lines, decentralization and the local elections that completed that process have created a new social contract between local companies, citizens, and self-governing bodies. And thanks to these new tax-raising powers that amalgamated territorial communities now enjoy, local governments now have more incentives to work with local businesses, to retain and attract businesses, and work harder to improve business and investment climate in their communities, thereby improving social cohesion and writing a new social contract. I think that we would be remiss if we didn't mention the fact that the new election code also changed the voting procedure for internally displaced persons, allowing IDPs to vote in their de facto, the actual residence, as opposed to where they're officially registered, propiska. IDPs for the first time were able to vote in local elections where they actually live. So that potentially enfranchised millions of voters, across the regions, and again, contributed to fostering stronger social cohesion in a somewhat rather divided society. So some people suggest that this new decentralization model will also allow Kiev to test run a future reintegration of occupied territory. So this is going to be a ready-made model. When occupied territories are to be reintegrated, they're just going to fall into that scheme. I wouldn't go as far in my optimism for reintegration in the near future. After all, there are several dimensions to the war in Donbass, as it is a function of unresolved differences on the one hand between Russia and Ukraine, and on the other between Russia and the West, and they have irreconcilable views of the European security architecture. So we are unlikely to see a resolution anytime soon. After all, Russia's Ukraine policy, which includes the military intervention, is driven by the Kremlin's goals in Ukraine itself, that it sees as a local war, and its desire to revise Europe's security order. So there's several problem sets there that need to be addressed, and that's why I don't think that reintegration is likely to happen anytime soon. Now, of course, the language of reintegration is going to appear time and again in various, in future prospects of Ukraine's conflict resolution initiatives, because international donors and various other stakeholders like seeing the word reintegration in Ukraine's future plans. It is, it's important for soliciting funding, and it's important sort of to keep eyes on the prize. But the rhetorical emphasis on reintegration will persist. But I think realistically, it perhaps may not happen soon. And lastly, again, in closing my remarks, I want to mention a few things about Donbass, a region that I follow more closely. As we know, in Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, people did not vote for regional councils, because regional councils, or the two regions, are run by Військово-цивільні адміністрації, VTSA, or military civil administrations, MCA, since 2015. And they report directly to Joint Forces Command and the Commander-in-Chief himself. So the Central Election Commission canceled elections in 18 frontline communities for security reasons, 10 in Donetsk and 8 in Luhansk. Now the decision it was very controversial, but decision was made both for physical security concerns and political instability. These sort of military civil administrations, MCAs, are particularly vulnerable to, the perception is that they're particularly vulnerable to Russian infiltration and disinformation campaigns. Therefore, elections are not recommended. It was definitely not geographical proximity to the front line that determined the security risk. For example, Severodonetsk, which was not allowed to hold elections at any level, is about 35 miles, about an hour away drive from the line of contact. And the security risk was considered too high. But Bakhmut, which is much closer to the line of contact, is about 14 miles from Zaitsevo, held elections. So it was not really a matter of geographical proximity. It was a very politically motivated decision that was based on people's likelihood to, the quality of candidates that people were likely to support. In fact, a friend of mine is the head of one of the military civil administrations in Donetsk region, and he told me that he recommended to the Central Election Commission that elections should not be held in Zaitsevo, one of the frontline cities, territories, because of his experience with parliamentary elections last year that brought to power, that allowed various questionable candidates to get elected. So it's not these sort of military civil administrations obviously are not the most democratic form of government, right? So these oblasts were set up, or these administrations were set up as provisional governments because of political instability and economic deprivation caused by the war. But they're working for now. There are temporary measures to prevent further Russian subversion across the line of contact. Now, there's various conversations going on right now, whether it is in fact not only undemocratic, but unconstitutional for the two regions of Luhansk and Donetsk to concentrate so much power in the hands of executive bodies that report directly to Commander-in-Chief and Joint Forces operations. It is, the MCAs, these military civil administrations, they have all the power to appoint executive heads of 18 local councils, mayors. They have unilateral authority to fire and hire people as they will. So obviously they could be run better, and local residents are not there's a lot of discontent, right, in the way Luhansk and Donetsk regions are singled out. In my opinion, that sort of form of government is warranted right now as a temporary measure, but as we know, there's nothing more permanent than something temporary. And I think because we're not likely to see a resolution to a reintegration of these territories anytime soon, these military civil administrations could benefit from some form of democratic component to it, like an advisory council that's that consists of citizens, residents of those areas, or perhaps formal mechanisms for complaints or other suggestions to allow organizations, business leaders, media outlets, political parties to formally report misconduct by MCAs directly to the GFO, the Joint Forces Operations Headquarters. But for now, it is what it is. Again, as temporary solutions, they seem to be doing their job just fine, but it cannot be a long-term solution because it will create more disenfranchisement and discontent among local populations in Donbass. And on that less than positive note, I'll end and hand it back over to Will.
Thank you so much, Elena, and thank you all our speakers. Just a reminder for our guests, you can submit questions via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page. Well, there's just a whole lot of issues that these three presentations raise. And I'm going to start with Misha and a kind of basic question. And that is, how did this question end up in front of the Constitutional Court? Is there a plaintiff? Are there a group of plaintiffs? Was it submitted by the Rada? How did this issue get presented to the Ukrainian Constitutional Court?
Oh, okay. Well, Will, the thing is that Ukrainian Constitutional Court cannot initiate any hearing on its own will. So there's always some initiative group. It's usually either president or over 45 MPs from the Rada, or recently there was an introduction of civil call to the, when a citizen can call to the Constitutional Court. But in this case, it was a group of MPs, and they were actually asking a little bit a different question, and the case is marginally connected with the decision. That's one of those reasons why the reaction of the public was very strong to this decision. So basically, the motivations of Constitutional Court in this case are not really clear. And this raises a lot of doubts, suspicions, and of course this entire criticism of the Constitutional Court that suddenly combined President Zelensky and pro-Maidan anti-corruption movements and G7 embassies in one camp right now that criticizes the Constitutional Court. That's, in a nutshell, that's the answer.
Thank you, Misha. And a brief follow-up, what is the level of protections for these Constitutional Court judges? I assume they're there for a certain tenure in office, that they have immunity, and obviously that theoretically they can't be removed. So what are the protections? And is the constituency to rally around these protections, or is Zelensky entering into some landmines by trying to undermine the independence of the court?
Yeah, this is a tricky situation. The thing is that these judges are appointed for 10 years, and there's no mechanism of calling them back. That's just not part of constitution or not part of legislation. Well, some of the constitutional lawyers in Ukraine, but also in Europe, were suggesting that the Constitution stipulates the principle that the body that appoints a constitutional judge can probably revoke him or her. In our case, there are three groups of constitutional judges, each consisting of 6 judges. So one group, 6 judges are appointed by president. Another group, 6 judges are appointed by parliament. And the third group, another group of 6 judges, are appointed by this supreme body of self-governance by judiciary. So all these 3 bodies right now have their representatives. Instead of 18 judges, today we have only 15 appointed. Parliament did not appoint 2, if I remember correctly, and judges did not appoint 1. But the situation is unstable because basically there's no mechanism, no constitutional mechanism or legal mechanism to change them. And President recently went to public TV show where he made another series of very important statements. And he was using the argument that also the sacking of President Yanukovych was not envisaged by constitution, but it was still done in February 2014. So this time he also is looking for political legal solution of the situation. However, it really creates the ground for possible impeachment. The current law on impeachment that was approved under President Zelensky and the majority of pro-presidential majority last year is, again, here I would cite several legal scholars saying that the law is of such a strange quality, let's put it this way, that the procedure of impeachment is not realistic. It's described in a strange manner, so it's hard to follow it. But still, it can create a very strong pressure on president and undermine his rule. So in a way, as Elena said it's self-defeating strategy. It's not clear why it was chosen, but it becomes deeper and deeper. And with every step, with every offered solution, it looks like the crisis getting deeper. Speaker of Rada offered another way of dealing with the situation, sort of consensus building, but it still has certain norms or solutions that are also not entirely supported by constitution.
Thank you, Misha. For Vita, I have a question about your conclusions about the building of political parties. Was it the intention of this legislation to promote small regional parties, or was it intended or anticipated that the big parties, obviously identified with individuals, but whether the big parties would be able to create more kind of regional links or national parties with regional links, and to strengthen the democratic process and political party building? Instead, what appears is that we've arrived at a more splintered political party system, and new actors and smaller political parties.
Okay, so thank you for a really interesting question. Regarding the, as I told at the beginning, the crucial changes to the code were adopted together with the, sorry, my kid. So crucial changes were adopted Zelensky party with close consultation with opposition Platform for Life. And this new electoral code and electoral legislation were developed for those parties who have strong party system, who have good regional branches, and these parties succeeded. In case, so that was the demand from opposition Platform for Life. So this legislation was good for them, and the elections show that they were right at the beginning. And Zelensky, I don't know what they expected. Maybe they would like to, feel that way. I'm so sorry. So they thought they were on the way, but actually Zelensky party, they didn't have any regional organization or any regional branches, and they sent their MPs to the regions as like смотрящие, like to oversight the election, but they actually not developed the their own structure. And you were asking, would the regional party transform for something bigger and go to the national level? You know, it's a really hard question because, as Elena said, that's not a regional, actually not a regional party. It's that's political projects of the regional business. And I am not sure that they will transform in something bigger. We had one not very good attempt of the so-called mayor's party to create nationwide platform that was called Propozitia Party. They united only few strong mayors and they win the election, but they don't have capacity to run on the national level. And basically, a lot of this regional party, I think they will stay as a regional project without further like upcoming and building to the national level. Sorry for my kids, they were like.
It's the hazard of the Zoom age. I'm hoping my cats don't make an appearance, but we're everything is successful so far. Elena, you made this interesting comment that I was just thought that you could expand upon, that Zelensky is a brand. And so to what extent is Zelensky a politician? And to what extent is he all show and no substance and just a brand?
That's a great question. Well, let's just say, well, first of all, up until last year, all Zelensky, professionally, his professional affiliation was in the entertainment business, right? So to your question, to what extent he's a politician, to what extent he's a showman, I think that proportionally, I think most of his experience comes from show business. And I think it's quite obvious now in the way his instincts, his professional problem-solving instincts sometimes where they take him, because he seems to default on kind of show business and populism as opposed to a more pragmatic technocrat style of decision making. And that's kind of really where incompetence manifests itself, where again it worked, it did its trick and it worked its magic during elections in mobilizing sort of nationwide electorate and sort of creating this Zelensky stood for hope. I'm not quite sure what he stands for now. I think there's an identity crisis because people are not sure what the servant of the people stands for as in terms of their identity. Because again, they're certainly not a party of hope as much as they used to be, given the multiple mistakes that were made, and as we're seeing right now, multiple crises that are unraveling. So I think in that way, Zelensky as a brand, to me, represented this party of hope. And I think that is wearing off right now. And there's nothing in its place. And then kind of show business populism becomes a sort of default place that Zelensky tends to go.
Thank you, Elena. I'm going to go to our questions in 1 minute, but just to remind you, you can submit questions via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page. Before I get to the questions, though, maybe Misha and Vita want to jump in on Zelensky, the brand. Is he damaged? To what extent is he damaged? And can he recover? Short answer is because we have a lot of questions now. But I want everyone to get a chance.
First. Maybe Vita
on
first.
Zelensky.
Okay, day after day, we see like bad steps of Zelensky, and it seems to be very unprofessional steps. And also we have seen already that his team has no strategic vision what to do. And I think he was he was a brand without those like professional and without this professional back and like vision of the future. So he just was like successful, one of successful stories, and he has nothing behind. And now, so in that way, I can explain what's going on right now.
Well, in my opinion, brand is a good metaphor to approach, but in a way, Zelensky is, as a phenomenon, as a political phenomenon, is non-professional, non-politician being a president. And he tries to continue it, but it has its own drawbacks. Well, lack of professionals around. So he himself could stay and remain at this position and promote this kind of behavior. But he would need professional politicians and administrators around, which is not the case. Even more, professionals are less and less eager to cooperate with administration right now because of permanent change of staff and lack of endorsement by presidential team of their own members. So it looks like this issue with the cadres, issue with the staff is growing. And recent local elections has shown that even in the native city of President Zelensky, he didn't have his own candidate. Basically, there's a candidate offered by the Rinat Akhmetov Corporation and endorsed by president and presidential team. And it's a very strange situation when right now Mayor Vilkul, who is running for continuation of his post, and the servant of the people candidate, who used to be a one group, political, ideological group, now compete with each other. And it's going to be a very interesting case, what's going to happen in the second round in Kryvyi Rih, in the native city. But definitely the Zelensky people are not entering into the power in local administrations.
Thanks so much, everyone. A follow-up question from Mark Temnitsky, similar to my question, but he just wants to know whether the results of the local elections translate to future political failures. In other words, is there a path to recovery? Or is this really kind of a fatal blow, the regional elections by themselves, and also the combination of the regional election results plus the constitutional crisis? So is there a road back to for President Zelensky?
If I may start, and then maybe someone would pick up. Here I would, first of all, thank you, Mark, for this question. And we expect to publish Mark's analysis of local elections early next week. But right now, I would say that there's still a possibility to go back for president, since the draft law was not supported or endorsed by parliament. It's not yet voted. There's also an opportunity for calling the roundtable, the national roundtable for different branches of power to come together and find the solution. Because here we have wrongdoings on all sides. And that could be the way, also strategic way for Ukraine. Because right now, Kennan Institute is preparing publication of history of Ukraine. And there, one of the dimensions that this history can be described, and we try to in one of the chapters, it's how Ukrainian constitution was not implemented. So this clause, this article, and with time, it's more and more articles and norms that are not respected. There's definitely a huge need for Ukraine as a republic to restart its political regime and return to the constitutional order.
Vita or Elena, do you have any comments on that?
I can add my 2 cents. I guess kind of to echo what Misha said, I think President Zelensky's problem right now is that he can be solving constitutional crisis by violating the constitution, right? So it's a kind of vicious circle. But I think that he would be wise to fall back on rule of law and stop playing sort of these populist games by they're deeply authoritarian. Whether the 5 questions that he introduced, these are sort of self-serving populist measures that tend to promote his brand. Again, going back to, I think he really needs to de-emphasize the show part of his brand and start emphasizing pragmatic political solutions and play politics. Unfortunately, the way politics must be played in Ukraine is building bridges, forming coalitions, making political offers that other stakeholders cannot refuse. And as they say, I think that the problem with Zelensky right now and his problem-solving mechanism is that he's trying to create a cure that is worse than the disease itself. And I know that phrase has acquired a different connotation since President Trump has said it so many times. But the cure cannot be worse than the disease, right? So if we're trying to cure constitutional crisis, then the worst way to do it is by violating the Constitution. I agree with what Vita and Misha said earlier, is that the brand has become toxic, and it seems to be there's a gridlock, right? But I still have a little bit of hope that, given that Zelensky still has 4 more years, that he can recover from this by again building strong teams around him, relying on professional opinion, and de-emphasizing the entertainment aspect of his political choices, and really forming coalitions. In Ukraine, it's all about building coalitions with other political parties. Those are the rules of the game. That's the only way to get things done.
Okay, I can give just like few.
Go ahead, Vita.
Yeah, what can I see? So we have this political crisis, we have constitutional crisis, and probably next step might be parliamentary crisis, because when we had this mono coalition, now it's actually dropped, and we see out of data with Chesna monitors that they lost this majority, and even this decision on constitutional court may divide the faction. So we can go deeply in the crisis, and it would be really hard to survive for next 4 years, as Olena told. So probably we will have pre-term elections, and this in the air, and this in this like today's Ukrainian discussions.
Thank you all. We have a couple questions related to the same theme from Glenn Wright, who works on Ukraine projects for USAID and the World Bank, and Mike Kashishian at USAID. And they both have a similar question. The whole idea was for these regional bodies to have regional support so that they can work on local affairs and improve local self-government. And they're both suggest surprise that the voter turnout was so low. So to what extent was the low voter turnout an indication that this reform, while again, very good on paper, as Misha talked about and others talked about the Constitution, very good on paper, but the realization of it has not inspired the Ukrainian people to rally around these local institutions? Or quite frankly, is it just too early to make a judgment about these elections? Obviously, we don't even know most of the results. Local politics is always local and always confusing. Does it need time to sort itself out? So Elena, Vita, and then Misha, if whoever wants to jump in first.
And give some perspective of this slow turnover from my side. So one of the reasons it was COVID. I know somebody think that political issues contribute more, but still, if we compare the turnover in different countries which have an election right now, we can see this COVID influence. So first, that was COVID. Second was that the loss of trust to the central government, to the politicians at all. And also difficult rules, and people do not understand how to deal with that vote, with that ballot, what to do. Should I check only party or candidate. So these rules were not communicated well, and people were like afraid to do something wrong. And also what we see that turnover was lower in the big cities and higher in these small cities and in the villages, because for them that was important. They have like election of the newly created communities, and for them that was important to have representative in the council from their own city or village, not from neighboring. And also people in the small communities, they know each other, they know the candidates. That's why it was easy to mobilize them to come to the polling station and vote.
Thank you, Vita. Anyone else want to jump in on the low voter turnout?
The thing is that there was a long-term tendency for lower participation in local elections. So in a way, recently there were everything started like 30 years ago with 70% of populations participating in local elections, and recently it dropped down below 50. So I would not really use this low turnout as an assessment of local administration reform. Basically, this reform is one of the most successful ones. It has a lot of problems, issues, but it really brought back life into local communities. I know from my own village community that has got suddenly a lot of resources for revival of public life, of some communal initiatives. And you can literally feel how people, local citizens, appreciate this reform. However, when I talked to my parents and the neighbors, they were saying, oh yes, it probably was a lower turnout just because many were not interested this time. Also, there was a sociological group rating poll that showed that the biggest issue was like lack of interest. Also, there was a certain division between generations. The biggest participation in these elections was on behalf of older generations, people older than 45, 50 years old, and only 11% of young people participated in these elections. In a way, Zelensky, even with the use of these 5 questions and the question of marijuana, did not provoke the youth to come to the ballots. Basically, it's the Zelensky's voters who did not go to vote. I would look rather to these groups of voters. So Poroshenko and opposition platform managed to bring their voters, and the pro-presidential centrist voters remained at home for different reasons, where epidemic is one of those important issues. So in a way, this centrism, this radical centrism, as they call it, of Zelensky team does not involve their voters to vote, but it does not have an assessment, the meaning of assessment of the local administration, territorial and administrative reform.
Elena.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry about that.
I just wanted to just make a quick comment. I think that emphasis on turnout has been a little bit exaggerated. I personally don't think that it's all that earth-shattering and that it's that unusual for local elections to have a lower turnout. And then keep in mind, there is a general election fatigue in Ukraine. Just last year, Ukraine had 2 rounds of presidential elections, parliamentary elections, and then only a year later, there's a new massive, local election with a new election code, new parties, new rules. There's a lot of novelty and a lot of expectations for Ukrainian voters who are, obviously preoccupied with other mundane concerns. And to put it in perspective, in the United States, for example, the average turnout for midterm elections, which are, quite consequential, one would argue, is about 40% at most. In fact, up until 2018 midterm elections, during Trump's administration, it was the first time that we saw a spike in the turnout in midterm elections. As you know, there are sort of parliamentary elections in the United States. But historically, about 30–40% is on average is the sort of typical turnout for regional elections. And I think Ukraine is similar in that way, because those types of elections tend to naturally draw smaller crowds. And all things considered, with COVID in the mix and in general election fatigue, or as Volodymyr Dubovik says, there is a Ukraine fatigue in Ukraine. It's not Ukraine fatigue, internationally. There is a Ukraine fatigue in Ukraine itself. So I wouldn't really I wouldn't really emphasize the low turnout as something that is necessarily indicative of a larger dynamic, other than those factors combined that are quite normal.
Thank you, Elena. Just a reminder, if you want to submit a question, you can submit them via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page. Our next question comes from Clifford Bond. Ukraine Invest has indicated that it will be selecting 3 regions to work with them on improving the business climate and foreign direct investment. Which level of government might take the lead on these business issues? The AOT, the rayon, or oblast level? That's a very technical question, but anyone have an answer?
Well, I would try. I would look at the level of local council, city council, big city council, or middle level city council, because in reality, oblast council has quite a limited influence on the real situation. And also the personality of mayor plays a very significant role. So the combination of mayor and his support by local community, by local council, that would create some more or less stable conditions for beneficial investment. That's my take on it.
Thanks. Another question about the vote, and this is a question about Zelensky's 5 questions. They seem to have been rather a distraction, as it were. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, why he proposed these 5 questions. There weren't any kind of legal consequences from these 5 questions. And was it kind of a distraction or a source of confusion during these elections?
So I can try to answer this question. That question. You see that I've considered this as a mobilization tool to mobilize his voters to come to the polling station, because some people were interested what's going on, how it looked like, what they ask. I would like to participate. So it was to mobilize his voters. Even some sociological research showed that this worked in that case. But actually why do we treat this like only mobilization tool? First, it was not approved by the Central Commission, Electoral Commission, and the Parliament. Second, there is no methodology behind it. Third, there is no understanding who paid for that, because it was quite expensive stuff. And also, we don't understand how the results of this polling will be used, because I think that they have just this short time to bring the voters to the polling station, and maybe to cover other gaps which Zelensky may face in the future. For example, if he had a lot of negative communication in line with the crisis in Donbass when he introduced Fokin to this Minsk group, and it caused like people were really unhappy. And now he can cover, for example, I have a question, I raised the question where people support reintegration of Donbass and some economical measure for that. So he trying to maybe to use the answer in the future for his own PR. But it was like mobilization technique from my side.
If I may, also in support of Vita's understanding, it looks like all these 5 questions were aiming at 2 different 5 voters groups that could actually provoke them to come to polling stations and also participate in this questioning. So in a way, as a marketing instrument, it could have worked. However, it wasn't working, but created a lot of issues for the presidential team. I'm sure that it was very unwise to come up with this kind of instruments, and it created a situation that adds to the political crisis that we currently have.
Thank you, Misha. We've talked about the role of prominent politicians. We've talked about the potential role and the role of oligarchs. The one player that we haven't talked about in this crisis, both the constitutional crisis and the restoration of regional self-government, is civil society. Now, obviously, there's not one focus or one spokesperson for civil society, but at various times, civil society, this amorphous but very important player, has played the determinative role in Ukrainian politics. So I'm curious, was civil society mobilized for these regional elections? And how does this constitutional crisis plays for civil society? Obviously, if civil society has backed the rule of law and legality, no matter what side you're supporting, this is not a step towards rule of law and legality. So if anyone can talk about the role of civil society, either in the regional elections or in this upcoming crisis on the Constitution.
As a representative of civil society, probably I can start. You know, civil society reacted quite quickly on the constitutional crisis, and the organization made a statement right after the decision on electronic declaration. So people were mobilized and do understand all the threats and risk connected to that decision. Also, I would like to say that civil society was not united, because we have different organizations inside have different opinion on how to solve this crisis. And it was like some supported the law submitted by Zelensky, and other part told that it's not constitutional decision. So some kind of compromise was found that NGOs decided to make a statement and appeal to the constitutional court judges and ask them to go off from the constitutional court. But I don't know how it worked. But today I just read news in Ukrainska Pravda. It says that those judges who voted for cancellation of electronic declarations, they decided not. They decided to temporarily stop their work in constitutional court because they are unhappy that draft of the decision on land issue became public. So they are afraid of public pressure. I am pretty happy that civil society is active in that case, that they can mobilize people. For example, they had this big, one of the biggest street action in front of constitutional court. But still, we have to remember that suggested solutions have to be constitutional, because we may create a bad precedent.
Thank
I
you.
just add to that
Elena.
a little bit. And thank you, Vita, for those thoughtful comments. Again, as a representative of civil society, I think that we should be reminded that the Ukraine's foreign policy vector is that with, in the direction of European Union, and that the national security strategy of Ukraine makes it very clear and explicit that EU and NATO membership are the vectors of Ukraine's foreign policy. Why am I bringing this up? It's important to realize that the development of civil society is one of the expectations of European and other Western donors and sponsors, because Ukraine continues sort of pursuit of EU integration, and a part of that ambition is commitment to harmonizing its institutional infrastructure with the EU standards. And the role of the civil society is critical to that institutional infrastructure to be in line with how other European nations do it, and the emphasis that they place on civil society. So I think we're going to see sort of continued prospering of the civil society and emphasis on civil society, because again, Ukraine's official vectors of foreign policy are EU and NATO integration, and by giving up on civil society, that would just be the last nail in the coffin. And that would be extremely unwise, and I think Zelensky knows it very well. And the role and the work of civil society, in my opinion, right now is really keeping the country afloat, it's survival at the moment.
We're coming to the end of our discussion. I just want to thank all of our speakers. If you have any short final word, you can jump in now, but just see if any final points or discussion.
Yes, I would like to say again to thank my colleagues and to the attention of our audience. And I would say that local elections, in spite of low turnout, proved to be a living democracy with a lot of issues. In the beginning, I told that we passed the system in many ways. And the electoral system needs to be rearranged and changed. However, it was a very important example of living democracy. And I'm happy that it's moving on, and that also civil society organizations were participating actively. It's not only Chesno, there was also Opora, many local initiative organizations that show that the spirit of genius, like local democracy is there. And I'm sure that after COVID, after these difficult times, that local communities and regions will be the points of growth for Ukrainian economy and Ukrainian political freedom.
Thank you, Misha. I always like to end events on a positive and optimistic note, and you've provided that very succinctly and eloquently. So I want to thank again all our speakers. Thank you, our audience, for your interesting questions, and we look forward to seeing you at future Kennan Institute events. Thanks so much.